Hi, everybody, and welcome into the panel room. Our discussion today is Beyond Bridgerton, fiction with Regency-era settings. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. I'd like to ask the panelists to go around and introduce themselves and tell us briefly what they write that involves in a Regency setting. And Deb, we'll start with you.
Okay, hey, I'm Deb Marlowe. I write Regency historical romance. I've written about, 28 or 29 of them. I have 3 series that have been out lately. Enjoyed them all, having a great time, going to keep writing more.
Jackie?
My name is Jackie North, and I write cowboy romances, but I also wrote a series called the Oliver and Jack series set in late Regency about the characters in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist and how they fell in love years after the ending of the book. And so right now the one that's just coming out is in Axminster Workhouse, where they've been arrested and of course are flung into the throes of the workhouse, which is Oliver's worst nightmare. And I would say that I wrote this when I didn't quite know what I was doing, so it's kind of like fan fiction, a story of my heart. And I have a very small handful of very passionate readers who are loving this series. So that makes me happy, but it is a very small group because they're very long and very dense and very, I think almost too much, but I didn't know that when I wrote it. So.
Annabelle?
I'm Annabelle Anders. I've written, I started setting my books in right around the 1815s, but as I've written, I've pushed it back. So my current books I'm writing are set in about 1830. So I kind of fudge with the Regency a little bit, depending on how you look at it. I've written about 30 full-length books. And I would say that I sort of write a Regency, it's like a Regency fictional world. So my focus is more on story and romance and dialogue set in the Regency world. But I don't have a history background. I got here by reading all of Mary Baylow's books. And that was my study of Mary Baylog. I've gotten her name wrong forever, but that's what brought me into Regency.
Okay, Jade?
Hi, I'm Jade Lee. I started out in the writing in the Regency. I started reading every Regency I could find, starting when I was a teenager. And those were all the traditional Regencies. And every once in a while, I'd kick into the historical, and there would be sex, and I was very scandalized, but I loved it. So I'm answering questions backwards. That's kind of how I started reading them. And then I got a degree in screenwriting from University of Southern California, an MPW degree, and was going to write screenplays. I was going to be a great screenwriter. And then we moved to Central Illinois. And so I was like, well, I'm not selling movies from Central Illinois, but maybe I read an awful lot of these historical romances. Maybe I should give them a shot. So it took me a while, but I did. I've now published under my different pen names. I'm Jade Lee for historicals and Kathy Lyons for contemporaries. I've done over 60 books because I've been writing for over 30 years. My most recent one is right here, Lady Scott. It's about a woman who was supposed to marry the hero of the previous book, Lord Scott, but he found someone else. So in a fit of pique, she says, I'm going down to London and I'm going to get me a easy to marry Englishman who does what I tell him to when I tell him to, and forget all the rest of you. So she storms off to London and then has several surprises in store for her. But I'm a full-time writer. It's what I do. And so I think that's it. Hi, I'm Jade Lee.
Katherine?
Hi, I'm Katherine Cowley, and my series that's out, the 3rd book's coming out in a couple months, is The Secret Life of Miss Mary Bennet. So it takes Jane Austen's characters, particularly Mary Bennet from Pride and Prejudice, and it makes Mary a spy for the British government. So it's a mystery series, spy series, dead bodies left and right, lots of real Regency historical events mixed in, and that's what I write in the Regency.
And I write historical fantasy set in the Regency period. I'd read a lot of it, and a lot of Regency romances and a lot of the more traditional Regencies. And this is maybe a good point to say the traditional Regency is very focused on the society and the manners, whereas the Regency historical has a broader plot and has, as Jade says, intimacy in the story. So, and then the books tend to be longer. But my historical fantasies, I have the novel, The Steel Rose, which is the second book in a trilogy. It's a standalone. And Napoleon has escaped from Waterloo with the assistance of French wizards. And so the English wizards are trying to figure out why, when he tanked the French economy and ruined the country leading up to his surrender in 1814, the Frenchmen are flocking to his standards. And they discover that there is a magical artifact that is drawing people to Napoleon's side. They have to stop it, and the action climaxes at the Battle of Waterloo. There's also a romance subplot. And then I have a novella in a series I just launched that takes place during the Peace of Amiens, which was a very brief break in the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France. So I've done some research for those books into the period. And so I'd like to go next to what first drew you into the Regency? What was your introduction to Regency fiction? Jade talked a little bit about this, but she might want to amplify it. Jackie, let's start with you.
My introduction was my older sisters reading Barbara Cartland until they would just stuff those books down their throat. And we made kind of mocked Barbara, bless her, for the ellipses, ... where the heroine takes a breath and she's just gasping and her bosom is trembling and she's wearing these interesting clothes and we just ate it up.
I remember all that.
Right? And she's just always a wispy little slip of a thing, and out of her depth, fish out of water, very, very good trope for that, usually poor or somehow marginalized, and it would be like the Duke and the schoolmarm, or the king and the serving girl, or the something, and they aren't always the X and the Y, but in my head they were. And when I went back to look, because I was going to I named my cowboy series, the Wrangler and the Orphan or whatever, I thought, well, I'm being really original basing this on Barbara Cartland, but she doesn't have the titles aren't all that way. So I was like, oh, dang, I remembered that wrongly. But in my head, it's always that way. So that's how I was introduced. And then in came Kathleen Woodwis, who was, all over the historical map. And it was the Wolf and the Dove. And I was, like you, scandalized that they were doing it and they weren't married. And yeah, I'll remember that one for a long, long time. So that's my introduction.
Okay, Annabelle?
I started out, I have to say my first taste of romance at all was Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. I know there was just a little bit of that in there, but then it gave me that taste of it, and I couldn't find a lot of romance books. And so I started reading Harlequin and read tons of Harlequin, through my high school years. And then I got married, had kids, went to college, and didn't do any reading for a while. And then my mom gave me my first Mary Belloc book. And one thing that I really found fascinating about it was it had dual POV. So you got to, and that was having read so many Harlequins, I was like, oh, I didn't even know they could do this. You get his point of view too. This is awesome. And so I kind of just dove in, read all those Lisa Kleypas, Tessa Dare, and I had tried, I had a background in journalism, and I had started some fledgling books going along. But the more I started reading them, the more I just started thinking, so many of these have the same storyline. What else could I do? And the bathtub is a real trigger for me for ideas. So I'll sit in the tub and just come up with different ideas of different types of heroines I wanted. But I have to say, just such a huge, Lisa Kleypas's Wallflower series. I don't like the really old bodice rippers, to be perfectly honest. I like it to jump right to the story. I like there to be a lot about the relationship. I like history, but I don't like to go into as much detail as some of the older books seem to do. Those are the pages I would kind of flip through. Maybe it's the ADHD in me a little bit, but yeah, so that's, I have to say, I wouldn't be here if my mom hadn't given me that first Mary Belloc book.
Jade?
Well, I read every Signet traditional Regency, which was always a comedy of manners, and it was always the hoyden who was wild, but the hottest guy in the book recognized her for being special, and she was always fighting all the restraints. And the hot guy, saw through all of that and all the time she messed up and got in trouble, and he saw her for the special person she was, which to my teenage heart was everything, because I had a very traditional mother, Chinese mother, and it was very much color inside the lines, and I was loud and big body movements, and I was always being told to rein it in and sit down and be quiet. So the idea that the hot, rich, titled guy would see me in my poor, as I struggled to follow the instructions of my parents, and yet anyway, so I fell in love with that, and I would read the book, and then I would go take a long walk or whatever, and I would rewrite it in my head. So when I failed in Hollywood and came back to Central Illinois, it was just natural for me to start reading. Well, and I'd already discovered the sexier Regencies, but it was a natural for me to start writing them now.
Katherine?
My first introduction was Jane Austen, which I guess kind of a stereotypical introduction to the Regency. My mom gave me Pride and Prejudice when I was 11, and I read it, and I had a reading log at the time, and apparently I really liked it. I can't remember reading it, but apparently I really liked it because I then read it again a few months later. So I started out with Jane Austen, and then it was Victorian rather than Regency, but really what got me into kind of the 19th century was the Amelia Peabody mystery series. So it features, if you haven't read them, they are just delightful. So it features a woman a Victorian old maid in her 30s, who her father dies, she has a bit of a fortune, she decides to go to Egypt and be an archaeologist, even though women can't do that. And there's a romance, and there's dead bodies, and there's murder and archaeology, and I just loved how it was interweaving kind of real history with the archaeology and pyramids and different discoveries with her romance and with a murder mystery. And so that really got me into I read every single one of those books probably at least 3 times. And then I didn't really get back to the Regency period besides Jane Austen until Shannon Hale's Austenland series. And even though they're not actually set in the Regency, they're set at, a Regency-inspired theme park, basically, or a kind of resort. But it made you think, there is so much that, that people are doing with the Regency. And I loved Midnight in Austenland, which is a mystery. And so then that kind of got me more into the kind of other stories playing with the Regency period in different ways.
Deb?
So I think like a lot of romance readers and writers, like even when I was a child reading, I was like always zeroing in on the romance. So I love Trixie Belden more than Nancy Drew because Trixie and Jim had that thing going, and so, that lifelong appreciation of redheads too, Jim, I always zeroed in on that, and I went looking for more of that, and I love the historical aspect. I am a history nerd. I love the research. I remember finding a whole bunch of Marion Chesney's, which were very traditional Regencies, at my library, and just going, whoa, and just devouring them all. And then like Jade, the Signet Regencies, I just love those early, like Mary Bellogg's first book, like Annabelle, just those old. And I just love the scenarios she would get her heroines into, she, the girl who just happened to be, stuck on the side of the road and is cold and shivering and has to wear this, flowery, feathery cloak because it's the only thing that she can find, and she gets mistaken for, a woman of ill repute, and all the stuff that happens because of that, so I would just, I just loved all those, and I just jumped right into, as soon as Regency historicals hit big, I just jumped right into reading everybody that wrote. So But I am a huge history nerd. I love working real history into my stories. I just love that, and I love using it to bounce off the romance or really involve it. Like the first book in my historical romance series, the Half Moon House series, there was this actual publication called the Harris List of Covent Garden Ladies. It was a year publication. Every year a list came out of all the ladies of ill repute in London with their names, their descriptions, their specialties, their addresses.
I love it.
And what would happen if a good girl's name got on that list? And that's what spawned off that book. So I just love doing that, working real stuff in. And I think my readers really seem to appreciate it too. So
It can drive an entire plot, something like that. I mean, you'll be looking for a little detail of something, and then suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, this just brings me full circle. This is just what I need.
right, yes. And what I think, I think as writers, we probably all have those magic moments where you're like in the middle of the book and you happen to go, oh, I'm going to look something up. And it's like,
Yes.
it fits so perfectly and it solves every problem you thought you might have with this book. Boom.
It's amazing.
So,
That's
yeah,
pretty
love
magical.
those moments.
Dave, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say that looking back at those old, I have summarized to other people, the plot of some Regency historical that I read decades ago. And I get this look and I'm like, look, it sounds cheesy now, but I swear to God, it was magical when I read it.
And I think it's still magical, right? I mean, I think one of the most appealing thing in Regency, I think, is besides as Shonda has shown us, the fantasy and the and the gowns and everything, is that juxtaposition between the rules and how to get around them, right? Like there's just something built in that.
It's a natural conflict.
Right. Yes.
Yep.
Well, my introduction to the Regency was at the beach with my parents. I'm a pretty fast reader, and there was not much to do when it's too hot to go out on the beach. So we would go, along the strip and into the drugstore to get a drink or whatever. And I found that was the summer I discovered not only Anne McCaffrey, but Georgette Heyer.
Oh,
And the first one I read.
There's a combo.
Yeah, it was an interesting combo. The White Dragon and Regency Buck. Regency,
I love the White Dragon.
Regency Buck.
Excellent.
both, yeah.
Well, they are. Although, there were a few moments in Regency Buck that made me a little uneasy when I first read it. And when I read it again as an adult, they make me very uneasy.
Mm-hmm.
But I remain in one little corner of my heart fond of Lord Worth because he was the first Regency hero I read. And I also bought that same summer the book that remains my favorite Heyer, which is Frederica. And I think the reason I love that one is it's not a standard Regency because of Frederica's brothers and sister. It's more of a family story than a hero and heroine story. And I like the way the kids provide comic relief. And then a friend of mine
Adventure.
Adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine put me onto Mary Jo Putney. She sent me a battered copy of The Rake and the Reformer. And that got me into Mary Jo's books. And then, of course, Regency historicals, I tend to like bigger stories. So while I enjoyed the Signet Regencies, I tend to like a bigger book than that, just in general. But I never tried to write it because I thought I didn't have anything to bring to it. People seem to do it so well. And what could I do that would be different? And then I was writing my trilogy for Falstaff, it's the Boar King's Honor trilogy, and it's set in 3 different periods. And the theme that runs through it is a family's effort to lift the curse on their bloodline because an ancestor helped murder the princes in the Tower, which Richard III is infamous for murdering, which I assure you he didn't. That's a whole panel in and of itself. So we won't go there. But the trilogy is about that. And so
Another era.
Yeah, another era. It seemed natural to go into the Regency for that. And I thought, well, I can write a Regency if I can add magic and ghosts and a magical artifact and a family curse, because that's more my jam than just the normal. Even the Regency historical has a certain amount of social manners in it. The social codes play a role in it. And then I got into it and thought, you can't write a historical set in the Regency if you don't pay attention to those codes. I mean, yeah, you can do all your little fun embroidery stuff with it if you want to, but I am a history nerd. So the idea of just blowing that off was anathema. And so those of you who've been in RWA are, I'm sure, familiar with the Beaumont. And even if you haven't been in RWA, you might have heard of it. And those people take their Regency really seriously. And then on top of that, I had the Battle of Waterloo, which is reenacted by literal armies of people who get their uniform right and their equipment right and their tents right and their kits right every year. So it turned out to be a little more intimidating than I thought it would be.
Yeah, I actually thought that when you said you were writing Waterloo, I was like, yeah, that's a challenge.
Yeah, the Osprey Publishing. And by the way, if you are looking to do any kind of military history, ospreypublishing.com has books in every era you could think of. And I will say they made a fair bit of money off of me because of this book. But that kind of leads me into, what did you do for research? Because it seems like there are varying levels of history nerdness on the panel and varying levels of interest in research. And I'm sure for writers out there, they're thinking, well, I don't want to do what she just talked about doing. Is it, you know, how much research do I actually need to do? So Annabelle, if you'll start us off and tell us a little bit about the way you did your research and how much of it you felt the need to do.
I think I had I have a natural fill in the blank sort of research mentality from my journalism background. So like I had read, I mean, I just consumed, and it sounds to at the risk of, being redundant, I consumed Mary Bellogg's stories. I mean, her voice was in my head. I had to stop writing in so much past because it sounded too much like her and my editors didn't like it. But I picked up, like, this is where I got the social norms, the imagery, another, and a lot, my historical training is not really, I think it's fantasy historical. So I would say for people, who aren't, who don't want to go into the nitty-gritty details and spend a lot of time finding books and locating books. As I write a book, I get an idea in my mind, but like you have to kind of get into the world. You have to put yourself in the world. But Bridgerton kind of opened the door a little bit more than I even had stepped through already, in the concept that it is truly historical fantasy, not in terms of fairies and magic, but in terms of dukes being clean with nice teeth and handsome.
Young and
this
multicultural.
Yeah, there's
Hallelujah.
So many aspects to it. It is fictional. It is a fictional historical fantasy world that so many of us are really writing in. And so I think once you get in that world, like Deb was saying earlier, though, that you'll go and you'll look things up. And I think that's where you can bring more history into it. But truly, I finally conceded that I was not writing Regency history, the true history of what's happening in the Regency, and that to go with my story flows, allow the rules and the norms that I'd learned and that I can feel to be in that world, because I want to put the reader in that world. But I had to recognize that my stories, my heroines are bold, they're outspoken, they do a lot more things than heroines could have done. The heroes are much nicer. I think but yeah, that once I conceded that, it actually freed me up with my writing quite a bit. But like I said, it is those things you have to stop and look up that so often just give you that part, that piece that that really reminds me I'm in the Regency world, and that that will turn my plots. Often it really does drive a lot of my plots. So, but yeah, I'm by no means a person who, I like looking at history things. I like finding historical things. I like walking through old houses and castles. But when it gets into the details and the dates and the names, I'm not a historian.
Okay, Jade?
I personally hate research. It's all about the people and the situation for me. And I like throwing in an ethical dilemma where, I can see people going either direction and then taking their moral stance and holding to it. It's all about the people for me. But I was fortunate enough I loved Regencies since I was a teenager. So I'm certainly back 20 years ago, I read everything I could get my hands on. And then when I started writing, I would do a little research, as little as humanly possible. And I would discover that the actual Regency period and what I had read in these Regency romances were very different. So if you look at the true literal history, this is not how they lived. And I liked the romance Regency world. And so that's, I can either look up specific details and, over the years, I have picked up more and more information. One of my heroines was the daughter of a shoemaker, and just the history of shoemaking, and women weren't thought to be strong enough to make shoes. And so I thought that was cool as hell. And in fact, the whole white gown and the wedding dress was not a thing until much later. What the brides did was they had a special pair of wedding shoes made, and then they would write the date and the bride and the groom's name on the sole, and that's what sat on the mantle as a memory. And so this was just a huge shock, and I built a story around it. Wedded in Sin, I think, is the title. And so over the years, I've picked up a ton of research, but frankly, I do the fill in the blank. I need to know, thanks to Shonda Rhimes and Bridgerton's, a whole new multicultural aspect has been allowed into the Regency. So suddenly I can pull in China into, my Chinese research into the Regency, and I can put aspects of multiculturalism in there that really were not there legitimately. But who cares? It's fun.
Fiction.
Katherine?
I kind of lean on the other side. I love stuff that is, that approaches history the way, I love those genres. But the way that I've written this particular series is very heavy on the research. So in my most recent book that came out, True Confessions of a London Spy, there are dozens of real historical figures in the book. So I've got Lord Cochrane, who his naval exploits and his work as a naval officer inspired the books and movies Master and Commander. So I've got Lord Cochrane, I've got his uncle, I've got, Sir Francis Burdett, so I've got all these real members of Parliament, I've got all these real historical figures. And so because I wanted to tell a kind of a murder mystery and a spy story with real historical figures, I kind of leaned heavily into the research. So, a lot of it was reading biographies of these people, and every single chapter in my novel has a real newspaper excerpt from the day that chapter is set. So then so it was this balance of not letting myself do too much research, because I actually love research so much that I could just spend years researching and be like Tolkien with Lord of the Rings, where you spend, a decade writing a language and then you maybe get back to the story. I could do that with history, so I have to pull myself back constantly. So it's me letting myself read a bunch of books on the time period and the history and Parliament and other stuff, actual nonfiction books on Regency spies and, the radicals and what they were doing, crazy stock exchange fraud, other things like that. And then I have to stop myself, and then I have to write, and then I will look occasional things up as I go, but a lot of it I have to write myself notes, because otherwise I would just go off the deep end and never actually write my book. So then once I've done the first or second draft, then I do more research to kind of fix things. And then once I hit about a third draft when my chapters are pretty solid and my dates and my timelines are pretty fixed, then I'll go in and just read dozens of newspapers from every single day that my book is set and choose such like, a lot of it's just these really fascinating snippets that kind of create a parallel story to what I'm doing. And then of course I find things that then I have to adjust things in my chapters because I'm like, that is way cooler than what I put in there. Like, who knew that this guy, you know, that this is what happened. And so that's kind of my approach, is very heavy on the history, and yet at a certain point I do fudge details. I have a nice historical note that it's like, I changed lots of things, including these ones, and kind of, you know, leave it a little open-ended that of course I meant to make those other changes too. But a lot of it, like, ultimately, even though I love the history, like, the history is subservient to the story that I want to tell and to the characters and the relationships. So if it's ever, like, if it's a choice between, like, have this, you know, obscure detail accurate, or focus on this obscure detail, or get to the heart of the story, then I'm going to choose the story. So for me, it's that balance of, okay, I know all this stuff, and then I have to step back from it and just choose carefully what to include, so it's not too much. So you just get kind of glimpses of these things, and it creates that story.
Okay. Yeah.
So you allow yourself to break the rules just so you know you're breaking the rules.
Yeah. You know, I know I'm breaking the rules sometimes, and a lot of times I don't have to. A lot of times it's
Right.
like, oh, I'll just tweak it. But then there are other times I'm like, I'm gonna break this rule, and, you know, change the date of this famous ball, and that's okay. I'll just, you know, put it in the notes.
Yeah.
That sounds fantastic, but it's way more work than I would do. Sorry.
So I feel like I'm in the middle between these two extremes you guys are talking about. I feel like at the beginning of when I first started writing Regency, I really, like, I just dove in, and I was like a sponge, just trying to learn everything. And I feel like I have a really good grasp of the period, and I feel like that serves me well, especially now, because it just makes everything easier now. I bought all the research books, I read them all, I joined the Beaumont, I had the discussions, you know, I did all that. And I'm just at the point now where, I mean, I'm a super character driven writer. Everything is about my characters and what's going on in their hearts and minds. But I love having something about history that is kind of involved or circled around it. And so I can usually just pick that one or two things and just do a deep dive on that just for one book. And so I feel like it's really a middle ground that I'm on now, and I really enjoy it. So I'm having a great time.
I honestly don't think doing more research can ever hurt. You know, it's like you're in the story, but I don't think it has ever hurt me to do extra research.
Just my deadline.
One of my favorite things, especially when I was heavily involved in the Beaumont, and there was a lot of, you can't do that, you know, kind of conversations. I love finding the real history that goes, no. Yes, you can. Yes, there really was a maid who married a duke. You know, yes, there really, you know, Anne Lister really was an pretty much out lesbian in the Regency. You know, well, she was actually a little later.
That Gentleman Jack.
But I'm sorry.
Was that Gentleman Jack? Yes.
Yeah. I've read about her for years. I've read about her, and I was just so happy when they finally did something with that story. So, and I just love her portrayal of her. It's just so good. So, but you know, I just especially early in my career, I used to get a lot of people who would write and try to ding me, you know, on the history. Right. And I'd be like, yeah, no, here's why this really is right, because I don't always go with I think for a long time there was a established Regency world, like you say, your own Regency world. I think readers had a shared Regency world, and not all of their beliefs about that world were real. you know, or maybe it was what was they're common in what they're reading, but it wasn't the real history. So sometimes I get a little ding by shaking that up a little, but I don't mind that. I liked it.
I always remember there was one Facebook post I came across about a couple of years ago that went on and on about the existence of doorknobs in the Regencies. And it was where I made this point where I was like, okay, if you can get it right, that's great. But it was amazing at how contentious it was. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't do this.
They had doorknobs.
But there's you would, by saying that statement, I mean, there were so many people that were like, no, they didn't exist. This was the first known one.
I've been in Regency houses. They have doorknobs. Right? Were they added? How did they get it?
And there was a lot of big names in it. There's, you know, that were just discussed, you know, and it was just like it really blew me away at how passionate both sides were about it. And it was authors and readers. So
yeah, I
remember when I discovered
Jackie, how about your research process?
My research has been a lifelong thing. I saw the movie Oliver when I was quite young in London. My parents dumped me off at the movie theater, and I was like the same age as the character, and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, and I sort of got hardwired. So I saw if it was set in Victorian times or late Regency or Regency, it was historical. I wanted to read it, see it, be it. So I, for years, have been absorbing all of this stuff, like young Sherlock Holmes and all those kinds of things, or kids who time traveled into the past, into Victorian era or the Regency era. So then I came across this book, I don't know, about 10 years ago. It's called Mr. Timothy. And this guy, it was written very well. He imagined what it would be like for Tiny Tim after his father died. And he had Uncle Scrooge, you know, who wanted to give him money, but Tim wanted to make his own way. And I was like, oh my gosh, I could do this. I could do this, right? So I said, I'm going to write these books. And so I started writing them. And I realized I had to read the book by Charles Dickens, right? Which I was like, okay, which I tried reading in junior high, didn't work because it's very dense. And so I read it and I realized, Jack gets deported halfway through the book. All the movie versions that I'd ever seen, he's somehow there at the end of the movie. And Fagin is hanged in Newgate, which I didn't know. And I'm like, I have to really, really buckle down. So I read every book about, you know, the city and the Italian boy and everything that had all these facts. And some of them were really glossy and superficial, you know, with pretty pictures of men in top hats. And others would tell you how much a tot of gin would cost you at the Seven Dials, in any pub in the Seven Dials. And that's where I wanted to be. I didn't want to be glossy and, you know, super fun to read those, very entertaining, but I wanted it gritty, dirty, smelly, and horribly confusing, and this wash of humanity, which was London at the time. So I'm at the far whatever spectrum of that, way too deep. And then I pulled back, and then I would be writing and something would come. Oh, there's a Greenwich fish fry. It costs 2 shillings. It takes you to and from 10:30 to 2. You get all the beer and fish and chips you could eat. Was this a thing or am I imagining? I would go look it up and there it was. So somehow all of that had sunk into me and I just would draw on it like a lesson you learned long, long ago. And then I would verify it because, whoa, the internet has tons of information. So that's me, way mired. Some of my readers have very kindly written, said, this is too dark, it's too much. And I said, well, I'm sorry, because it's all written now. And I've learned from that most readers want to go so deep and no further because they're looking to be entertained, not tortured like I've tortured my characters. So way over here as far as research go, way too much. But I love it.
I feel like a lot of it depends on setting your expectations. I also did like a film minor, so I have a little bit of a film background from college, and they talked about the reader-writer contract. And just, you know, that at the beginning of a film or the beginning of the book, you set up a contract with your readers. And so I think a lot of it is about kind of setting up what your story is going to be. You know, if it's going to feel like the fact that I put a real newspaper headline before my first chapter, well, I've made a promise. So now I better get certain historical, like political details right, because I just made a promise about politics. Versus if you set up, hey, I'm going to do, you know, like a grittier Regency, or I'm going to do kind of a you know, the lens that Bridgerton takes, kind of a fantasy historical, you know, like, so you kind of have to set this up in the first 20% of your story, and then you get that buy-in. And of course, there's going to be readers who don't accept your reader-writer contract and read anyways, but I feel like if you set this up, then the people that read on past your first 20%, they've agreed to your contract. They've agreed to however little or however much historical research, however, you know, fantastical or however you know, gritty, you know, that you've set up. You know, if you're going to include magic, well, have it in the first 20%.
Right.
You know, set this up so you've got that buy-in.
Well, Oliver's at a funeral for Mr. Brownlow, and he also gets belittled by Mr. Grimwig, and he's miserable. So I figured that should have warned him, tipped him off that the rest of it's going to be pretty much, you know, putting Oliver through the hoops. But I think they were expecting that I was kidding, or maybe that I would pull back. And no, I just go even deeper and deeper. You're right about that contract. I don't think I knew how to write them back then. This is, you know, 10 years ago. So I learned a lot since then about that very thing, about setting it up for the reader by the blurb and the cover and the tone, and letting them know what they're getting. That's very
And there's
important.
always going to be someone upset anyway. So
Yeah, that's true. That's true. They don't like it for whatever reason.
Not every
There's
reader
always
likes
going to be
everything.
a reader who's looking to nitpick. You know, there's just a certain number of people who just enjoy that. Like, that's their entertainment. So.
Mostly I get readers who really, really dig this kind of stuff because they want that reality. And most of it, you know, that's about 20%, and the rest of them like my cowboy books much better. So, you know, I've got to pick a balance there, I think.
You know, I think that it's interesting when you talk about reader-writer contract. I think that also applies to your steam level. Like, you know, and like a lot of my books, when we're somewhere in the middle, we're not like super spicy, but we're not like sweet.
Right.
That when you know your characters are going to have open door sex as you get, you know, certain ways to set up and give clues in the early part of your book to so that reader really kind of knows it's coming. So that's an interesting note, because I hadn't thought about it that way though until you mentioned that. So
I had heard it with your first chapter sets the tone for the whole book, but I hadn't heard that about the reader-writer contract in the first 20%, and it makes a lot of sense. For me,
it's also all about the marketing. Sorry.
Oh, it's huge. That's huge though. It's got to be in the blurb, the cover, the title, all of that, which is hard because so many covers now don't look spicy. You know, the pastel girl standing on the front. It's interesting.
This has spice.
Right? Isn't that interesting though? Because I'd say even 2 years ago, that would say sweet.
Yep.
Or maybe even just a year ago.
Well,
now,
Dragon Blade has worked very hard to brand all of their books. And I am on the low end of spicy for Dragon Blade.
wow. Okay.
And I am not low spice. Although, I mean, I was writing through the period where I was getting a requirement of number of sexual scenes per book. And
oh, wow.
So, yeah, it was, I wrote on the contemporary space, I wrote for Blaze and for Brazen. And they said 5 sexual scenes minimum a book. I never made 5. It was more like 3 or 4. And in my current
the great erotica period, right?
Yeah, and erotica was even beyond what the Blaze and Brazens were doing. But more and more now, I'll have 1, maybe 2 hot scenes, but they are well worth the time and effort.
Now, are these in your Regency set books too?
Yep. The 5 requirement, no, but especially, you know, so 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where everything was going hot, where the traditional Regency was, you know, you'd get 1 every 2 years released and it did terribly. Everything was going hotter, everything required more graphic. I had my agent say, can you make at least some voyeurism in there? And I was like, I don't know.
Well, for me, the history is really important because I'm a history nerd. But that's why I write historical fantasy, not historical romance. Yeah. Because I think if you write historical romance of any variety, the history has to take a backseat to the romantic plotline because it's the romance genre.
Yes.
And I just want to put in a plug for Teresa Desjardins' book, Jane Austen Shopped Here, which is a comprehensive Regency reference.
What's her
and I
name?
use, beg
Yeah, I
pardon?
gotta get that.
It's huge. I mean, it's a compendium. It's not small. And I did cut down a lot of the bowing and the curtsying in the social scenes because I wanted to keep the story moving. But I think different readers like different things. I mean, somebody who reads a historical anything by somebody who usually writes that is going to expect that. And I think if you get a lot into the history in the beginning, like Katherine was saying, they expect that. And so,
And also the fantasy too, right? Yeah.
right, and the magic.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I
I have
read
a novella
probably
series.
Beg pardon?
I have a novella series with pixies. So there's, that's kind of a, it's a Regency set pixie tale that was in
You
an
don't know,
anthology
that could
series.
be real.
But yeah, you got to have that right out at the beginning, right?
Right. And I read probably 5 books just about the Battle of Waterloo and the book about the Duchess of Richmond's ball, which took place the night before the fighting started. And they don't agree
I use that
on what
too.
happened in the climactic moments of the Battle of Waterloo. There was disagreement among the sources, which really surprised me because it's such a famous battle. And so I did what Katherine was talking about earlier, and I put in a historical note, which said the sources disagreed. This version worked best for me. It was only in one source, and there was some implication that whoever reported it actually made it up. I don't know. But it was in an actual book with history on the spine. So I took that and used it. But I wanted to pick up on something Deb said a minute ago about you can't have a chambermaid marry a duke. When I first started reading historical romances, knights were all the thing. And then earls became all the thing. And now dukes are all the thing.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the ideal hero in a Regency romance, or do you have an ideal? Jade, will you start?
I have been fighting that progression. I started whenever, where the hot title was a Viscount, and it's steadily increased. And I have fought it all the time. I don't want to do a Duke. That's pushing the history too far. And yet I have been overruled by editor and agent. And my agent looked me in the eye and said, "You're writing Regency romance. Nobody cares but you. Make him a Duke." But I swear to God, I am going to write a series. I'm going to bring knights into the Regency where they get knighted at the end. That is my plan. I have not yet got a editor or publisher to sign off on that, but I'm going to do it. A really smart commoner. I've been getting more and more, and this is not typical. This is not historical either. I like my heroines to have a passion, like medicine or architecture or archaeology or you name it. I want them to have a passion, which was not part of the traditional Regency romance novels even.
Right.
But that means I have to start doing research into, okay, were there women architects or wives of architects who happened to do some, and so I'm starting to get into, more and more research of what the actual medicine was. And I've done a ton of midwifery research lately. So
There's your research.
Yes. And because I have a purpose, I'm, but this is my plan.
It's easier that way. Like you just pick that one subject and you dive deep, and then, and the more you do that, the bigger your comprehension of the whole.
And that's going to drive so much of your character and what she does. So it's like a win-win.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Katherine, what's your ideal Regency hero?
Well, I mean, since I'm in the mystery space, it's not as influenced by kind of like leaning towards dukes. I mean, Duke of Wellington, like your book, Nancy, Duke of Wellington does make an appearance in my 3rd novel, but he, despite being quite a philanderer, is not available to my, or of interest to my characters. I mean, I think for me, what makes a hero interesting is just kind of the you know, that they have some sort of tension in them, whether or not that's tension with their station or with their occupation or with something they're seeking for. So I think to me that's what is most interesting is, you know, someone that has some sort of tension that's going to impact their decisions and their relationships.
Yeah.
Me? You know, for me, a perfect hero has absolutely nothing to do with a title. It's all about what's in here and what's in here. You know, that is irrelevant to me. I know that dukes are popular. I know that, you know, fantasy is popular, and I am perfectly happy to write a nobleman. But I've written artists and mathematicians and astronomers and, you know, that kind of thing too. So, you know, it's all about what's going on inside them, and I think part of the appeal of the Duke and that kind of thing is because it comes with so many constraints, you know, for them, that kind of a thing. So totally, that would lend itself to character, you know, but it's all related to the character for me.
Okay. Jackie?
Mr. Darcy. That's it, Mr. Darcy. He's my ideal hero. I didn't understand him, and then my sisters were swooning and swooning, and finally I got to see the A&E on BBC, you know, where Colin Firth dives in and they're all like sighing. I'm like, oh, I get it now, right? So, because I just heard about it, and when I saw that and the way the character developed, I thought, that's the guy. That is the perfect Regency hero for me.
Annabelle?
And he was a Mister.
Yes,
That's
he was.
right.
That's,
Yes, he
that's what I
was.
I think
With
like
10,000 a year.
right.
like Deb said, I'd say any titled gentleman or brother or son of a titled gentleman. But what is key for me is that he has to be having some dawning epiphanies as to the problems in his station and where he's at. And although he can't change the world, he makes changes to create a better world for the people he has power over. And that's probably one of the things that I, you know, where you really, you know, step away from the history of it, because my guys are not into the, you know, they're not lovers of all imperialism, even though that's where their fortunes are from, you know. But yeah, they have to be having this epiphany that, you know, women should be equal. And this is where I really get into the fantasy world of it. But that's really important for me. Otherwise, I wouldn't feel as comfortable writing about it and idealizing them.
Well, I think that's, if you don't mind me jumping in and commenting, I just think that is the essence of the romance that we write, right?
Absolutely.
They all have to figure out who they are, what their deal is, and they have to fix it and earn their happily ever after. And part of that is figuring out their place in the world, and just like you said, making it a better place and finding that equal, you know, just pure love, and, you know,
and that's
all
a
that,
lot, the tension that Katherine, was that you who said that, you know, that the tension inside of them is that there's a bit of, you know, this conflict, this you know, dissonance inside of them about who they are and who they want to be. So once they've accepted that, then they've sort of earned that happily ever after.
Well, and even if you're not writing a romance, even if you're writing a mystery or a fantasy adventure or whatever, the hero has to be somebody, I think, who is aware of the world around him and of the differences in it. And every character has to have an internal conflict, a growth arc in it. And I've been impressed with the way Erica Monroe and Grace Burrows, to name two, write heroes and heroines who are not nobility. Mm-hmm. And their stories are every bit as engaging. I mean, it's a different, you don't get the grand ball and the sweeping gowns and the fairy tale elegance, maybe, but it can be just as good a romance or just as good a story without those things. If it uses,
well, and all the societal constraints are there still, right? You know, yeah. When you're in a class system, you know your class, you know, and you know everybody else's, and you know, that's always part of it, right?
My favorite line in any movie this is from, As Good as It Gets, is where the male, lost his name, but he says, "You make me better. You make me want to be better."
Mhm.
And I'm like, there's a romance right there.
That's it.
That's it.
Well, we're
In a
coming up
nutshell.
on time, so this will be the last question. What for you is the most fun about writing in the Regency? Katherine, you want to start?
I just like this, it's a period that has so much that was, wrong or broken. There's a lot of like oppression, and there's like a lot of other things that happening, but there's kind of that sense of wonder about it that I really like, and that sense of opportunity or possibility, that sense of like, kind of striving. Like my favorite Regency characters are always ones who are striving for a little more, what are pushing against societal constraints. So there's just something wonderful, about that, that I always like. And I do love, of course, like the dresses and the fashion and the, the way they spoke, other things like that. But I just, that sense of wonder, I think, is what draws me to it.
Okay, Deb?
So there is so much going on in this time period. Everything is changing in the Regency. Society is changing. The Industrial Revolution is coming up, is starting at the beginnings. Political, everything is changing, and there is just so much to explore, and so much of people going on, and just story fodder everywhere for me. That's what I love about it. Plus, long pretty gowns and and guys with breeches and boots. I'm sorry, who does not love that, right? but there's just so much to work with. I love that.
Jackie?
Of the clothes, of course, the gowns and the breeches and the waistcoats and the boots and the bonnets. The only thing about Bridgerton that I would complain about is the lack of bonnets. Now, I know why they did it. They did it consistently, and they did it on purpose to create sort of this look and feel for that. So I get it, but I'm like, oh, they would look so cute on those bonnets. But the thing I like about the Regency is what I like about small town romances. Everybody knows everybody. Whether you're in the city of London and you live around a square, or you're in a small village and there's the village green, Mrs. Jones down the street is out of candles, and you need to bring, and your reputation precedes you, and everybody knows who you are. And so those are the constraints under which they have to work. They don't want to cause gossip, yet they want this thing, this impossible thing. And so how do they work around that? So that's what I like, is that tight-knit, kind of intimate space that the characters operate in.
Okay, Annabelle?
I think it's, there's something that you can do. You can take problems that we face today, and you can plunk them into the Regency world and their rules, and it works. And it gives you a different way to work through them. But inevitably, I don't ever mean to do it, but I bring current things into the Regency, and then when you do a little bit of that research and you start to see, oh, it's just happening all over again. And I think I love that about it, that there is such relatability, even, and it's interesting. I wasn't a history person when I was in school, but then when I get into thinking about some of these things and diving into looking at newspapers or something in specific, that it fits. And I think that's really fun, and it's a great escape.
Okay, Jay?
I don't know that I can add much to what everyone else has said. Yes. My favorite thing as I write is that moment when a character's world expands, oh, wait, you are a person, even though you're a bootblack. Or, there's just an industrialist versus an agrarian society, all of that change over the women who have all these rules and all these bindings, quite literally, in their clothing and in the societal rules, who dare to say, no, I'm going to do it differently. And the men who appreciate them for that. Just, there's so much room to have a narrow point of view that gets expanded in all sorts of different directions. Every character, but especially the hero and heroine, that they each come to a moment, broader moments, or successively throughout the book, each one expands the other. That's my favorite thing to write.
I like it because it is a period of change, and it is a period of conflict. I love the 1920s because on the one hand, you get flappers and 23 skidoo and everybody parties while the farms are quietly sliding downhill to the Great Depression. And the Regency has some of the same things because you have turmoil in the lower levels of society. You have the Industrial Revolution displacing people, and then you have the ton with their elegant parties and their elegant lifestyle. And there's so much to choose from in that period. I think it's really a rich field to mine. So to wind up, let's go around one more time, and everybody please tell the viewers where they can find you on social media, and if you have a recent or upcoming release that you'd like to mention, this would be the time. So Deb, will you start?
Yep. I have a lot of research related stuff on my website at www.debmarlowe.com. If you are interested in that kind of thing, I have a series of videos where I make historic recipes in my modern kitchen. So that's really fun. I call it Deb Marlowe's Regency Kitchen. And, you know, I'm just find me on all the other social media. You know, I'm on Facebook, you know, Deb Marlowe, at Twitter, at Deb Marlowe, Instagram, all that. Just come find me. I like to talk about books and movies and recipes and men in boots and all that. So
okay, Jackie?
happy to talk.
Oh, did you want to mention a new release, Deb?
Oh, yeah, this fall I have a brand new series coming. It's called the Lockstone Hollow series. It's set in a village. It's my ode to the Regency version of Stars Hollow in Gilmore Girls.
Oh, nice.
I'm super excited about that. I'm having a ball with it. So yeah, watch for that this fall. My last series is all completely finished now. It's called a series of unconventional courtships, and that one is about a group of Regency guys who have all like had really bad, horrible home lives, and they've all bonded and kind of created their own found family, and how, aww, you know, none of them are very trusting, but love comes and picks them off one by one. So
okay, Jackie?
I am at www.jackienorth.com, and there's my contact page, has everything: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, my Facebook group, my newsletter, all that good stuff. My release coming out next Tuesday, as a matter of fact, the 21st of June, is In Axminster Workhouse, which is the third book in my Oliver and Jack series. If you're into gay cowboys, I have a whole Farthingdale Ranch story, kind of like you say, Deb. They come from different backgrounds, and they find love in spite of themselves, which is a trope that I really, really love. So www.jackienorth.com.
Okay. Annabelle?
My website is www.annabelleanders.com. But I can't come on here and not plug the most recent release I've been working on. Is I'm going to just show the Sunflower series.
Oh yeah,
the Sunflower season that Jana McGregor came to me in March, and she's like, we should do a little series. It's a charity thing. And you know, we ended up having so many authors come in it, and it's like 75 stories. And then Amy Quinton, she's an author, she volunteered and did the formatting. And I have to plug this because she made it easy to get around in. You know, we had some issues you might have seen with our pre-order got canceled, and you know, but we have made back that $20,000 so far, and we're excited. We're going to pull the book down the end of July, but we're hoping to just send a really big donation over. It's all for humanitarian. We've got some two good charities we're going to split it up with, but for anyone who hasn't had a chance, it's like 70 books. But it's not like you don't get lost in there. You actually have categories you can work from and kind of jump around to exactly where you want to go. So yeah, thanks for letting me do that.
Sure. Jade?
I am at jadeleeauthor.com. I am not the porn star, so that's why you have to do jadeleeauthor.com. I'm on. I know I should have looked it up before anyway. So, Jade Lee author. My most recent release is Lady Scott right here, which I talked about at the beginning. It's the middle of a series, but all of my books are pretty standalone. I apologize. I'm sitting in this hotel room. I have a whole setup in my office, but here I'm like balancing my tablet on a chair. So it's been kind of wobbly. So I apologize for that. But anyway, Lady Scott is the most recent release, and my newsletter, all the different Facebook, Instagram, whatever is at jadeleeauthor.com. So thank you for having me.
Glad you could join us. Kathy?
So I am at katherinecowley.com. I'm also on Facebook, Katherine Cowley Books, Twitter, Instagram, as Kathy Cowley. And my most recent book is True Confessions of a London Spy. And this is Mary's first assignment in London. And so she's there with Darcy and Elizabeth and Georgiana and Kitty. So a bunch of, favorites from Pride and Prejudice. So we've got this balance of, okay, she's really worried because she's Mary Bennet. She's really more worried about the dead body of a Parliament messenger, but she also gets to go to these balls and is kind of getting swept up in everyone else's excitement over the balls. And then, kind of her world of spying is colliding with her kind of social responsibilities. So it's like sneaking out to spy and what's the consequences, and really the heart of the book is like, can Mary Bennet actually have a relationship with her sisters? So that was really fun for me to kind of explore those possibilities. So that's my most recent book, True Confessions of a London Spy.
Well, you can find me at nancynorthcott.com. I'm on Twitter more than is probably good for me, and you can find me there under @NancyNorthcott. I have a Facebook author page, but I don't really spend very much time there. My Regency set novel is The Steel Rose, which is the second in a trilogy, but you can read it as a standalone. And that's historical fantasy. I just launched The Merlin Club, which is a historical fantasy series, all novellas, about a group of magically gifted wizards working covertly for the defense of Britain. And they are all standalones, and they are set in different time periods. And they'll be out. The Merlin Club is the sort of origin story for the group, and it's set during the reign of Charles II. But the next two are set during the Regency and the Napoleonic Wars. Hussar's Bane is set in 1816, and then Conspiracy's Web is the one set during the Peace of Amiens. So those will be out sometime this summer. We haven't set release dates for those yet, but they'll be out this summer or maybe in the fall. So I'd like to thank everyone on the panel for participating. I really appreciate all of you being here today. And I'd like to thank everyone for watching. And remember, you can always find us on ConTinual, the convention that never sleeps.